growth of what we know as the N-Chain Group. The intention was that over time, N-Chain would grow into a very significant company and organisation, and it's always easier to document things as they occur and as the company grows, rather than 10 years after the fact sitting there trying to write the history of the company from an informed position. So that was why O'Hagan was retained. I had no involvement in the retention of O'Hagan.
Who did that?
McGregor handled that personally. In fact, it surprised me when he came and said that he had retained a person to perform this role. I thought that was something that was going to occur significantly later down the track. And O'Hagan was retained without proper non-disclosure and contractual arrangements in place, and what he published on his own.
Okay. Well, at the end of the day, as we all know, Dr. Wright was actually quoted by these two media outlets. What happened from there? The winter 2015 and going over to 2016.
I was at the airport in Sydney when both those organisations, within the same half-hour period, it seemed like, released their stories, and at the same time, within the same hour, the federal police turned up at the office with a search warrant. So I vacated my plans to travel back to Manila that morning, and I went back to the office to try to understand what was going on and work out what the best approach was going to be.
Did Dr. Wright flee from Australian law enforcement authorities?
No. Craig and his family were staying in a service department in the centre of Sydney because they had vacated the family home on the North Shore quite some time earlier, and the home was empty. In fact, the home was at the point of being handed back to real estate agents as part of a formal handover. And when I got the phone call from the office about the federal police being there, and then 2 minutes later, phone calls to say, have you seen the news services? I also got a phone call from the lawyers that have been working with us for months and months on this transaction to make sure I knew what was happening. And their advice to me was, this search warrant introduces another complexity, and they weren't, I mean, these were lawyers that represented, you know, corporate issues and tax issues.
Okay, but let's jump to their conclusions.
Their conclusion was, they introduced me to John Laxon. John Laxon said to me, he's seen the search warrant. There is no reason why we should change any plans. We should continue as we were, and that was that the Wrights were going to travel to London within a few days anyway. I spoke to Mrs. Wright. She organised a ticket for Craig to leave Sydney that day. I asked the lawyer if that was advisable, and he said absolutely.
Okay. Did they end up in London?
Sorry?
Did Mr. and Mrs. Wright end up in London?
Yes, they did. I flew back to Manila and spent 2 days with Craig in Manila on his way to London, and then he reacquainted with the family in London.
Did the outing of Craig Wright as Satoshi Nakamoto change any of the priorities from the encrypt entities or Mr. McGregor?
Yes, it did, and it changed materially. We went from the original plan of building a company around this intellectual property, and then an engineering group around that and building products and services. We went from that to a high priority of dealing with promoting Craig to the world as Satoshi Nakamoto.
Whose idea was this?
This was promoted by McGregor.
And was Dr. Wright happy with that development?
No. I spent the majority of my days acting as a mediator between the two.
Why were the proofing sessions, and the court has already heard about these sessions, why were these sessions arranged?
There was pressure daily on Craig to do public stage events with streamed broadcasts of him signing with keys. As part of the mediation and negotiation on what Craig would do or wouldn't do, we got to the point where he agreed that he would do a single private proof to somebody that, and at that point we didn't know who. It was me that suggested to Craig that John Matonis might be a viable candidate for a private proof session given John's history in the Bitcoin ecosystem. I had previously spoken to John once in my life on the phone, and Craig agreed that John would be acceptable to him. And then I contacted John, asked him, he agreed, and then a proof session was set up, but Craig put some boundaries around what was to occur.
What about the proofing session with Mr. Andresen? Were these sessions supposed to be one session or two separate sessions from the beginning?
From the beginning it was one session with Matonis, and then it became, let's do another session. And it was John Matonis that recommended that I contact Andresen and invite him for a session. And that was to accommodate the constant pressure that was still coming for Craig to do a public signing.
Were you yourself present during the proofing sessions with Mr. Matonis and Mr. Andresen?
I organised both and I was present at both.
Where did they take place?
They took place in a room in the business centre at the Covent Gardens Hotel in Sydney. Oh, sorry, in London.
Do you remember the dates?
I don't
No,
exactly know.
but this is the spring of
Yeah.
2016.
And they took place quite some time apart because Andresen was reluctant to come to a proofing session without satisfying himself that he was coming for genuine reasons.
Okay. And how did those two persons, and let's start with Mr. Matonis, was he actually convinced by the proofing session that he had?
Matonis, when I met with Matonis to discuss the proofing session, he said to me, "This is no surprise to me. I met Craig at a conference in Sydney last year, and I ended up spending quite a bit of time with him in a coffee shop talking about a variety of topics. And he said, I had the strangest feeling at the time that I was talking to Satoshi Nakamoto." He actually told his wife that, and his wife told me recounted the story to me later. But John was keen to meet Craig and do this proof. When we met, the people in the room were myself, Matonis, Dr. Wright, and McGregor. Matonis signed a non-disclosure agreement. He and Craig spoke for about 15 or 20 minutes about various things in the history and other topics. the framework was that nothing would leave the room. John could choose any three at random from the first 10 or 11 blocks, the keys from any one of those first 10 or 11 blocks, and that Dr. Wright would use that key to sign a message. So from memory, Matonis chose the keys from block 1, 9, and I don't remember whether it was 3 or 7 or 5, but both Andressen and Matonis chose block 1 and 9, and they both chose different blocks in the middle for the third one. And Dr. Wright had no idea as to what the selection of keys would be. He came to the room with all the keys from those blocks, and they were given, the request was given to him one at a time. So there were actually 3 signings in each signing session.
These signings have been controversial in the years to come. Do you know whether Matonis maintain his conclusion from 2016?
For the record, Matonis ended up sometimes about a year later working with nChain for 8 or 10 months. After he left nChain, he and I didn't speak until about 2 months ago. And I was in London and I thought, I'll reach out and see if John is around the place just to catch up. And he and I met for breakfast, and I spoke to him about the signings, and I spoke to him about his blog posts. And he said something to me. He said, Stefan, you'll notice I have never recounted what I said. I meant what I posted, and I stand by it today.
And when was this?
8 weeks ago.
Turning then to the proofing session with Mr. Andressen, it happened at the same place?
It happened in the same hotel. It happened in a different room. The configuration of the room was different. So they were either adjoining rooms, but they were in the business centre because the furniture was different. But yes, it happened in the same place.
Mm. Could you very briefly give the court your recollection on what happened during the proofing session with Mr. Andressen?
Well, it was pretty much the same. Andressen and I met, we went into the room, Craig arrived, then McGregor arrived. There was a signing of an NDA. There was discussion around what the framework would be, and then something different happened. Andressen and Craig sat next to each other with writing pads, and they spent probably an hour to an hour and a half talking about Bitcoin concepts and algorithms and designs and question and answer sessions. It was really a tutorial session. And in the end, I said, can we sort of like get to what we're meant to be here for? And then you guys can spend the rest of the night doing this if you want. So that's when we then moved into the signing. The signing occurred the same as it did with Matonis. It was done on Craig's laptop. And then Andressen said, when I leave this room and I eventually talk about what's happened here, I'm going to get all sorts of doubters. So I need to make absolutely sure that I haven't been, there's not something strange going on here. So I want to do this proof session on my laptop. And at that point, Craig said no. And it's not that I don't trust you, Gavin, it's that you walk out of here with that laptop, you walk out of here with information that we agreed you wouldn't take out of this room. So then there was 15, 20 minutes of conversation, and it was agreed that we would call somebody to go to a computer store in central London, buy a new machine, bring it to the room, and that's what happened. A new machine, a laptop was acquired from, I think it was Curry's in Oxford.
Curry's, is that the retailer?
It's a retail store.
Okay.
It arrived at the room. The box was handed to Gavin with all the packaging and invoicing with it. He